In this video, I'm covering 10-ish tips on how to manage moisture on a backpacking trip. Okay, the weather is definitely not being kind to us on day one. Yo guys, what's up? My name's Pi. On this channel, I talk about lightweight backpacking and wilderness adventures. I've thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, as well as some other crazy trips around the world, including this summer a northwest to south coast traverse of Iceland. About a week or so ago, I asked my followers on Instagram if they'd be interested in seeing a video where I cover my top tips on moisture management, and it was a resounding yes. So let's dive into the tips right now. So the first tip, in my opinion, is the most important one. It's just get ahead of moisture management. A lot of the tips that I'm going to be talking about in this video, you might think it sounds a little bit silly or that it won't make a big difference. But if you're employing all of the tips I'm going to outline together, then you're going to be ahead of the curve. So a lot of the tips I'm talking about here, it's kind of more preemptive than anything else. But this stuff is very, very important, because if your gear gets wet out there, then you are going to be in trouble. Just don't get lazy, I guess, is the biggest thing. Just get ahead of it and take care of it and make it a priority. Tip 2 is to waterproof your gear properly. And this may sound really obvious, but I've also been guilty of this myself, where I've kind of just gotten a little bit lazy and let one of my layers get damp. There's probably 100 different ways that you can waterproof your gear effectively. The way I like to do it, generally speaking, is to use a trash compactor bag inside my backpack, and I put all of my important layers in the bottom of that bag. So we're talking my sleeping bag, we're talking a spare set of base layers, we're talking about a puffy jacket, all that stuff that you're not going to be using throughout the day whilst hiking, but you need it to stay dry, goes inside the trash compactor bag. I twist it up and I stuff it back down in there. And then I do also employ stuff sacks as well. For example, my ditty bag is a hyperlight mountain gear pod where I put all of my small bits and pieces in there, and it's pretty waterproof on its own. But then if it's crazy raining, I might take the pod and stuff it down inside the trash compactor bag just to be sure. Whatever really works for you, just employ a system and stick to it, and don't get lazy. Don't allow your stuff to get wet in the first place. The next one is a big one, and it's to dry out your gear whenever you get the option to. The best way to do this is, if you take a lunch break and the sun is shining or it's windy, then to take everything out of your backpack, lay it out in the sun or the wind and let it dry out. What I recommend people do is to lay some rocks or something down on top of that gear to stop it blowing away in the wind, because the last thing you want to do is your tent, your expensive DCF tent, to blow away in the wind and get shredded on some bramble bushes. Consider taking an early lunch break. If you're looking at the weather forecast, or you've started hiking and it's kind of mid-morning and the sun's shining and you're not sure it's going to be shining later on in the day, take an early lunch break or take an early break. Just basically use any opportunity you have to dry out your gear. Tip number 4 is to sleep with your tent doors open whenever possible, especially if you're using a single wall trekking pole style tent. I get a lot of questions from people here on my YouTube channel and on my website. Hey, how does that tent perform? Does it get a lot of condensation? Does this tent get a lot of condensation? My advice is to not really worry about the specific tent and how bad condensation is on that tent, because pretty much any tent is going to get condensation. So sleeping with your tent doors open, if it has one door, open one. If it has two doors, open both whenever possible. If you have a gentle breeze blowing through your camp, that's going to be the best way to reduce the amount of condensation you get on the inside of the tent. So position the tent so that the door is facing into the breeze, so that the majority of that breeze comes in through your door and passes through. That's going to help minimize condensation. Of course, if it's crazy windy and crazy cold, then you want to position the foot of your tent into the wind so that the wind kind of scoops up and over and away from your tent and doesn't drive into the tent itself, but make use of a breeze in camp if you have one. This is an interesting one, and one that I took advantage of on the Iceland trip I was just talking about, is to dry your socks or gloves inside of your pockets while you're hiking. I know this may seem a little bit gross, especially if you're on a long distance thru hike and your socks are pretty nasty, but it does work. I'm generally hiking in running shorts, or on the Iceland trip, for example, I use these are called the Terrebone joggers from Patagonia, and they're fantastic. They're basically like running shorts, but pants. And the type of fabric that used is very lightweight, it's very breathable. They also have like a mesh pocket. So if you take a wet glove or a wet sock or a wet buff or something like that, and you put it in your pocket whilst you're hiking, there's a few things that's going on there. Obviously your body heat is warming everything up and enabling stuff to evaporate more easily. That kind of, this is a merino wool sock from Beliga. If this is completely soaking wet, when you put it inside the pocket, the material of the running shorts or the pants is going to basically help that moisture evaporate in combination with the heat generated from your body, and it really does work. I'm not necessarily saying that you're going to have completely dry socks and completely dry gloves by the end of the day, but again, it's getting ahead of the curve and using all of these tips in conjunction to dry out your gear as effectively as possible. This next tip goes hand in hand with the previous one, and that's basically to wear damp layers to help dry them out. And so what do I mean by that? For example, it's the end of the day and you're wearing your hiking clothing, maybe you're wearing your rain jacket and everything's just a little bit damp. Don't immediately take off all of those layers unless you have to, because by wearing your layers, you're going to help to dry them out. Of course, if you get to camp and you're kind of already wet and you're getting cold, then of course it makes sense to put on dry layers. But if you're not, then keep them on, because the longer that you keep them on, the more likely they are to dry out. This also applies to hiking. So for example, you wake up in the morning, the weather's a little bit better than it was the previous day, but your rain jacket's a little bit damp or your mid layer's a little bit damp, and maybe you don't need to wear that layer otherwise because maybe it's warm enough to not need the mid layer, or it's not raining so you don't need the rain jacket. But if you throw it on for an hour or 30 minutes first thing in the morning, that's going to enable your gear to just dry out that much more effectively. Tip number 7 is to carry a small piece of cut down pack towel. What I usually do is I dry off the top of my sleeping bag. So if you can imagine, I'm inside my sleeping bag, I've warmed that sleeping bag or quilt up through the night, and then the outside layer of the sleeping bag has generated some condensation because obviously there's moisture in the air, mainly from my breath. Obviously most good quality quilts and sleeping bags nowadays use hydrophobic down, which is amazing. But of course I just want to minimize the amount of moisture that soaks up into the sleeping bag. And if I wake up in the middle of the night, you know, maybe I need to pee or I want a drink of water, and I notice that there's condensation on the top of the sleeping bag, I'll grab the pack towel and I'll wipe it down as best as I can, because if you just didn't touch that, obviously that moisture is going to build and build and build, and where is it going to go? It's going to go inside the sleeping bag, which is obviously something you don't want. It was a bit cold, but it's still coffee. The next tip is to not be lazy in town and use town stops as a good opportunity to dry out your gear. If you're on a weekend backpacking trip, of course this doesn't really apply, but if you're on a through hike and you're in town every 4 or 5 days, then when you get into a motel room, take out everything from your backpack. If your tent's wet, go outside, shake it off, and then leave it in the corner of the room while you're in town, and that'll just help it dry out. Make sure it's one of the priorities of when you get to town is to dry out all your gear. You'll be really thankful for it when you get back out on trail that first night. The next tip is to use the mesh pocket on your backpack effectively. So, for example, you'll see a lot of through hikers with their tent stuffed into the mesh pocket on their backpack. I'm not really sure how much that actually helps to dry out the tent, but what it does is it helps to separate your wet gear from your dry gear. But then what it's also doing is it's making the tent readily accessible for you to dry out. So as I said, when you're taking a break, take your pack off, pull the tent out of the mesh, hang it over a rock or somehow lay it out to dry in the sun, and then when you pack up, you can either stuff it back in this mesh pocket if it's still a bit damp, or hopefully it's dry, and now you can stuff it in the main body of the backpack itself. The next tip is to set up your tent as soon as you get to camp and pack it down as late as possible when leaving camp. Basically, what that enables you to do is you get into camp, tent's kind of damp, you set it up, open up all the doors, let the wind blow through it, let the sun shine on it, and that's going to enable the tent to dry out a little bit before you throw everything else in there. So for example, if you've got a bathtub floor inside your tent and it's a little bit damp, don't throw everything else in there. Just set the tent up, leave the doors open, go make food, go get water, do some stretches maybe. Let that tent dry out as much as possible before you put your sleeping pad in there, before you put your sleeping bag in there. And the same applies in the morning. My final tip or thing I want to talk about is what to do if things just go horribly wrong, like the worst case scenario. And we had this happen on the Iceland trip, and it was miserable and really scary, but it was also just a really good learning experience. And it was great to see that all of my kind of training or experience came into play, and we made it through a sketchy scenario. You've been hiking all day. All of your hiking layers are soaked. You know that inside your mesh pocket, your tent is completely soaked, and then also your sleeping bag is a little bit damp from condensation. Oh, and it's also raining, it's very windy, and it's like just above freezing. That's pretty much the worst case scenario. Inside your backpack, you should have spare base layers, a top and a bottom. You should have dry socks. You should have a beanie. You should have a puffy insulated jacket, maybe an extra pair of gloves, maybe an extra buff. You should have a fully dry set of clothes inside your backpack. If you haven't, because you've been wearing them during the day, I would say that you're doing it wrong. For example, if it's so cold during the day that you've needed to wear a beanie, then you should be carrying two so that you have a dry one inside your backpack for the evening. But in that situation, you get to camp, you're really cold, everything's soaking wet. What do? You immediately get into those dry base layers, you put on the puffy, you pull up the hood, you zip it up, you put the beanie on, you put the socks on. You blow up your sleeping pad, okay, your sleeping bag or quilt is a little bit damp, but you get inside it, maybe you make some food, and you just kind of have to suck it up at that point. Are you going to be comfortable? Probably not. Are you going to sleep very well? Probably not, but you'll be okay. Then the next morning, you wake up and you have to do an assessment of the situation. You have to decide, okay, do I need to get out of this situation that I'm in, or can I continue on hiking? If you wake up and the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, then you should be fine, right? Because you can take all of these tips that I've already given you and put them into play. But if it's crazy windy, crazy raining, and there's no chance of sun, you might need to make the decision to kind of get out of there. So you look at your maps, you find the nearest trailhead or road and you beeline for it. If you have to hike 2 or 3 days to that trailhead or to that road, it's gonna suck. It's going to be really miserable, but what else are you going to really do? You put on the wet clothes again and you start hiking. Don't be tempted to wear your dry clothing unless it's an absolute emergency. Put the wet clothing back on and start hiking. Take advantage of these tips I've given to you. If it gets sunny, it gets windy, use those opportunities to dry out your gear. Keep pushing forward until you can get yourself out of that situation that you're in. So I hate to be a little bit doom and gloom at the end of the video, but I think this is important information and I'm speaking from experience, and I'm really hoping that you guys can learn something from this. Now, it's over to you guys. I'd really like to hear if you have any more tips out there that might be helpful to people. If you have any questions about the things that I've talked to you about in this video, then do leave them in the comments below. I'm looking forward to sharing those Iceland vlogs with you guys. I'm in the process of editing the videos from the trip, and I'm really excited about them. They should be dropping the first one probably realistically in January. So if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss those. If you've got anything else for me, you know where I'm at. Thanks for watching the video, and I will catch you in the next one.